My name is Harriet McBride Charles Johnson, and I'm in Charleston, South Carolina. I'm a lawyer in solo practice, and my practice emphasizes disability issues. And in addition to that, I write, speak, and try to organize on occasion. I think my first connection to the movement was when they convened local meetings that fed into what was called the White House Conference on Handicapped Individuals back in around '76. And I went to my local community forum, and from there, met some folks, talked to some people, and I was selected to be a national delegate. And that was really my first exposure. I met people from states where it was already happening in California, Colorado, Massachusetts, and really found out that it was possible to do things differently. I was very impressed with Ed Roberts, Judy Humans, people whose name I don't remember, who I had a meal with or shared a long line at the elevator, where we just talked about our lives and what we were doing. And from there, I did a lot of reading and really got kind of fired up that the way it's always been is not the way it has to be. It was wild, and when you say in a coordinated fashion, well, it's all relative. I seem to recall there were about 700 wheelchairs and maybe 2 elevators, and that may be exaggerated with the passage of time, but it was a chaotic mess in a lot of ways, but also just really exciting and freeing. And for me, kind of like going home, because I grew up in schools and camps for people with disabilities, and it happened to be a cross-disability world. And it had been a while since I had really been, part of the gang and had that kind of community. So it was really very, very heady. Well, I think they're like any other form of ghetto. They shouldn't exist. They're an injustice and a wrong. But inevitably, they build community. So like a lot of people from a lot of different kinds of ghettos, there are very mixed feelings, but I really developed a sense of we-ness with other people with disabilities, and not just the obvious cases that look like me, talk like me, etc., but people with mental retardation, crazy people, blind people, deaf people. Those, to me, are my home folks. Well, I mean, there was dialogue then, and it's not a simple question because it's not like a traditional ghetto or community where, I mean, there aren't, with a few exceptions, there are not disabled neighborhoods, disabled families, disabled churches, disabled restaurants that you have with most communities. Um, our community was, in the beginning, a community of exclusion. It grew up in institutions of various kinds. It was a product of segregation. And most of us had non-disabled families, and we're kind of dispersed and disconnected. But and there are certainly many disabled people that are not connected to community. They don't know anyone like themselves, or anyone else. Um, but for some of us, there is community that's very real and very powerful, and I never feel totally at home anywhere else. Um, well, I think isolation from society it's always a negative on self-esteem. I think you need other people to find out who you are and find out who you are and to be able to. I think you can appreciate yourself when you appreciate other people. So you need some kind of a community. Um, but when you say isolation from society, if there can be an alternative community, and to me, it was very important to build my self-esteem that I had that alternative community. Growing up, my best friends were literally my best friends were people with disabilities, not some of them, all of them, and because I knew they were good and valuable, they were funny, they were helpful, they were, whatever they were with their disabilities, it was pretty easy for me to know the same thing about myself. While if I had been in the non-disabled community exclusively, I think there's a greater likelihood that I would have judged my deficiencies a lot harder. So I really think people benefit from having that alternative group, but it shouldn't be at the cost of being removed from the mainstream group.
Early thoughts.
It's just a constant fact of life and always has been. I mean, I know when I was very, very small, a couple of the aunts, the maiden aunts, would lavish presents on me. And my mother actually told me, well, they feel sorry for you. They feel sorry for you. And they shouldn't, she said. And so from a very early age, I knew that people had weird ideas about me and the world was wrong about me. And that's something that I think most children don't realize, that grown-ups can be wrong and the whole world can be wrong. So that's just been a constant thing. And it's something that I typically don't notice because it's been constant until maybe some new non-disabled person comes into my life and, we're walking around town and the other person is like, do you always get stared at? And I'm like, well, yeah, sure. And I realize, okay, that doesn't happen to everyone because I've never lived any other way. Well, I can't really speak for the experience generally, but in South Carolina, people don't know about the movement because it's really not here in the way that it is in other places. And we do have a kind of a fledgling network of independent living centers. We have a protection and advocacy system that I'm really proud of. I was on its board for 10 years and just got off, and I think they're doing terrific work. But it's kind of, professional based, handling cases, and it's not out there on the streets and in the news very often. And in South Carolina, I think we have the added dynamic that the culture is really hostile to confrontation and even organizing. Our model is patriarchy, and it's the idea is that you get things done by knowing people, and the inside fix is the way to solve problems. And so, if you go out on the streets, it's like admitting you don't know anybody, that you can't get your problem fixed. It's an admission of weakness. And so even people who don't know a soul and have no power, are reluctant to make that admission. And so if everything's happening behind the scenes, and things do happen behind the scenes, a lot of, progress is made in that model, but the downside is that it's not visible, and people can't hook up with it. People can't get a vision that things are changing and that they could contribute to that change. Well, a fairly recent development that was significant here was the Olmstead Supreme Court decision. And there was this organizing going on around the country around the fact that the attorney generals of various states had signed on to a brief saying basically that states ought to be allowed to confine people in institutions who don't want or need to be there. And a lot of us found that to be a pretty outrageous position. And as you know, the court was being asked on the other side to rule that institutionalization is segregation, and segregation, last time I looked, was discrimination, and that discrimination violates the ADA. So that was the issue, and a lot of attorneys general were on what we thought was the wrong side of that. And South Carolina's attorney general at that time was a man named Charlie Condon, who was very, very famous as an advocate of states' rights on a variety of questions. In fact, a lawyer friend of mine with Supreme Court connections said that, the high-powered federalism lawyers called the most extreme states' rights position Condon-esque, that he had his own adjective. And so a small group of us took it upon ourselves to basically give Charlie a hard time about being on the wrong side of that brief. And we got a meeting with some of his people, again, doing it the inside way, and we made our pitch, and we were politely heard, and, it was clear that we were going to get blown off. We'll get back to you. Thank you for sharing your views, blah, blah, blah. And I got a wild hair, and I said, well, we need to know by day after tomorrow because I'm having an event at the state capitol, and I need to know what to say about the Attorney General. I had no plans to do that, but having said that, I went and took out a permit, and he wound up pulling off the brief the next day. And it was like 2 days before the oral argument, and I would like to think that the justice is getting a letter that this position was too extreme, even for Charlie Condon. I would like to think that that made a bit of a difference. And we went ahead with our event that I had taken out the permit for, and there was a lot of discussion. Well, what do we say about Charlie? And the consensus was, well, he did the right thing. Let's don't embarrass him. Let's don't say anything. And so we had a rah-rah Olmstead event where we talked about the issue. And I remember the consensus was that we should not call it a rally, because rallying on the state capitol is what, the rabble do. So it was it was an outdoor meeting, I think it was, So it was a meeting with, loudspeakers and signs and everything you would associate with a rally, but not a rally. And it was a very nice thing as it happened. And when the court did ultimately rule the right way, we were able to build on that strange little event and pull some people together. And the governor appointed a task force on home and community-based services, which ultimately issued a report, not a plan, but a report that included people with disabilities who had real-world experience, and that was a better document than it would have been, and if implemented would do some good. But all of that was, a real opening, because it started with a bit of a victory, and it brought people together with the idea that what we want is not crazy. The Supreme Court agrees with us, how radical can it be? And we definitely haven't realized anything like, not even 10% of the potential. But I think the Olmsted case is one that we should remember in our history. Yeah, and I'm really not familiar with the current incarnation of Mikasa. I don't know what that means at the moment, but as originally conceived, Olmsted goes beyond Mikasa to create a general right rather than carving out a percentage of the long-term care budget. I think Olmsted gives us a hook to say, we don't want 25% of the long-term care budget. We want it all. That's what we should be saying. We want it all to serve people where they want to be. And it's pretty powerful stuff, and it has the seal of approval from a very conservative Supreme Court, so that's cool. Well, I think he should know, or she should know, that a lot of folks are still in them, and a lot of folks have come out of them, and find out how that happens, and it's definitely still happening in South Carolina. It's scary, but kids ought to know that it's more likely than not to happen to them in this state if they're unable to get in and out of bed unassisted. If they live long enough, it's their most likely fate. It's my most likely fate because that's what the government will pay for without a lot of hassles. And I grew up knowing that because I saw members of my peer group go in one by one by one, and in one memorable occasion, there were 4 kids from my school who graduated into an institution. They had caps and gowns and graduated them out of my school into an institution. And so I knew that it was a real risk that I could not turn my back on if I want to be free. And I think most disabled folks, like other folks of all ages, live in denial. If we don't think about it, it won't happen. But we do need to know. And any nursing home you go in, probably anywhere in the country, and I know here, anyone you drop in on, there will be 1 or 2 young people. They're all dispersed. They think they're the only one on the planet. But they're in there. They're still falling in there. And of course, it's an equal tragedy that all those old people are there. What a way to end your life. None of them want that. And what South Carolina and other places need to realize is that it absolutely does not have to be. We should look at institutions as a serious violation of human rights. We should look at those people as political prisoners because it's our political decisions on how we spend our money that put them there. Well, to me, you kind of have to work on 2 fronts. You have to do what you can do to keep yourself free. And that means, putting together your financial resources, whether they're benefits, work, a combination of the 2. Your social networks, most of us depend a lot on volunteers of one form or another. More than we ought to have to, but we do have to. Put together everything we can to function, to be connected, to have people care about what happens to us, and be willing to go to bat for us when the chips are down. because we've all, we all think, well, I'll take care of myself. But a lot of times people fall in when they have been in a car wreck or when they're sick, and they're really not able to keep it from happening. So having those networks of people where somebody else would be standing by and saying, absolutely not, it's not acceptable. We have to come up with something else, and who will fill out the forms and throw fits and do whatever it takes. I mean, I think we really have a duty to worry about our own individual freedom. But beyond that, we have to realize that none of us can really be secure in our freedom until we all are. And we need to hook up with anybody who's doing anything to say, our long-term care dollars need to be available where people need them and want them. It shouldn't be all or nothing. You shouldn't be totally dependent on the state for all your needs or have no help at all. If you're getting by, but, a little bit of help here and there would enable you to continue to get by, give people that. Don't wait for caregiver burnout and abuse. Nip it before people are overextended. And we have to do the politics, and and I'm in favor of taking to the streets on occasion, telling people the truth. One thing I do is I am very upfront about the fact that I don't put on my own clothes. I don't wipe my own behind. People are really flabbergasted that know me as an attorney. Well, how can this be? You practice law, how can this be? And I'm like, well, they're two different things. And so people need to understand that reality and break through this notion that, when you need help, you lose control and you're no longer a full person worthy of being included in the community. Well, the culture is always evolving, and one thing that's happened is a lot of snowbelt people have come down here. And, I think that migration is not a bad thing, and a lot of Charleston people have gone to New York, and as a result, it tied with us for America's Most Polite City one year, We've had a lot of migration up there. So those influences are good, and the experiences of people that have gone beyond this world are good too. But one thing I do every year is a protest of the Jerry Lewis Telethon. And my first few years, I turned myself wrong side out to try to get my disabled South Carolina friends to come out. They wouldn't. And over the years, I'll still invite them, and once in a while, one of them will show up. But on the whole, it's become people that from social justice organizations, public interest attorneys, people who don't mind doing that for a couple of hours. And I buy them lunch, which, is always a great motivator. But I just, you have to work with where people are. And lots of folks told me, well, I agree with you, I'm glad you're doing it, rah, rah. But no, I know I'm not coming out there. It's, it's too confrontational. It's too weird. Well, I don't know. In the Crip school that I went to, I was there in 1969 when the hospital across the street from us, the non-professional workers went on strike. And it was a big deal. And we rode by their picket lines every day and gave them the victory signs. Our school was totally racially integrated when most schools weren't. And so we were affected by the civil rights movement, but we were children, and I mean, there was no question of actually doing anything. But we would joke around, we'd hear about sit-ins, and we'd be like, yeah, we wheelchair people, we'd be good at that, ha, ha, ha. And, different things like that, We ought to do that. We're segregated, ha ha ha. But it wasn't anything real. It was a joke. It was not a joke, but a fantasy. And we had no idea that at that very time, people in California were sitting in here and there, and it wasn't ha ha ha. It was real. Um, but so I mean, I don't really remember, a notion of a disability civil rights movement until after the White House conference. And I guess the first time was only like a month before, but the Section 504 sit-ins making the national network news were the very first time I saw these other people in other places doing things. And, it was all of like 30 seconds. But it was so delightful. It was so wonderful to think that people were out there demanding equality. And I mean, obviously they were right. Well, that's true. I'd forgotten about all that stuff. 4 or 5 of us went around, and everybody was doing 504 training, and we got trained and trained and trained. I went to one on vocational education, access to vocational education in secondary schools. I went to one on access to legal services, and they were of varying quality, and the idea was to train cadres of advocates to get 504 implemented. And when we came back home, some people were receptive and some people weren't. Um, and I think it was useful activity, but it didn't really translate into anything you could call a movement. Yeah, and when I said earlier about the insider approach, that's how things were done. And um, there, Arthur Ravenel was a member of the state senate for some years. He was a member of the U.S. Congress when ADA was passed, and he does have a son with Downs, and he and the boy's mother, Louise Ravenel Doherty, um, were leaders in getting some of the first special ed programs off the ground. They were leaders in moving folks out of the big institutions into community-based residences, that whole, array of issues. And, he had a very close connection of wanting the best for his son and, of course, being unable to understand that his son was one of many who had potentials and dignity and rights. There was a state senator, Hayward McDonald, who was post-polio and walked on, with braces and crutches. And he was a leader in architectural barriers and a variety of issues. So it's not like nobody was doing anything. But when we talk about, disability culture and a disability movement, that's just not the way it evolved here. My family is fairly chaotic, and which I think was kind of a lucky break for me. I did not have overprotective parents. I'm one of 5 children, and we were largely kind of expected to fend for ourselves. And that had advantages and disadvantages, but I think for a disabled child that can really be kind of an advantage to be expected to fight your own battles and deal with your own mess and, get things done. Um, there was, I think, there was a certain amount of stress in the early years when the doctors had them believing I was apt to die any minute, and periodic bouts of illness, but I think on the whole, I was less trouble to my parents than my 4 siblings because they kind of knew where I was and what I was doing. The disability did limit the ease with which I could get into trouble. I went to a non-disabled high school, and what happened was when I was 13, I was basically kicked out of the Crip school, and coincidentally or not, I was in the middle of a campaign to get the teacher fired. And the same teacher called my mom and said, we cannot teach her anymore, which may have been true. But anyway, at that time, this was 1970, before what is now IDEA, the public schools offered 1 day a month of homebound instruction, and none of the private schools, parochial schools, would even talk to my parents about taking me when they found out I could not go to the bathroom unassisted. It didn't matter that I had been restricting my fluids for years and don't go to the bathroom during the day. I still don't. But none of that mattered. They wouldn't talk to me. But it happened that my mother, again, the South Carolina way, had a very dear friend on the faculty of one school, and she basically agreed to handle any difficulties I might bring with me. And so it was a college preparatory school. In fact, its name was College Preparatory School, that where normally you had to take an entrance exam and blah, blah, blah. And they let me in anyway, and I had spent all my years at Crip School basically writing book reports, because that's what I like to do. So that's not a bad foundation for going into the 9th grade anywhere. They kind of assume you don't know anything else, and so I did that curricula through the 11th grade. And then I went to a college where my mother taught. And again, this was before Section 504. And it was the only accessible college in South Carolina. It was a Baptist school, and they had decided to make it accessible, from some sense that this was a Christian thing to do. No legal obligation. And so they happened to be accessible. My mom was on the faculty, and I wasn't asking to stay in the dorm. That would have been impossible. So I was able to go there. And that school was actually a lot less fancy than the high school I had gone to. It was, an open admissions kind of place. And so I was, very well prepared by that time. Well, I'm not religious, but I'm around it enough that I think religion is so diverse that you can't really talk about it as one thing. And religions are powerful forces in the state. And in some situations, for some people, their religion drives them toward justice and human equality and the respect for the dignity of all people. Martin Luther King was a good Southern religious guy, and there are lots of people with that kind of religion in this state. There are other people who are, influenced by Bible stories in the New Testament to see religion as something that will go away if you have enough faith. And the converse of that is that if it doesn't go away, it must be a mark that you're a bad person, or somebody's being punished or tested, or any of those things. Those systems to make everything meaningful are a bit problematic when some things just happen. But there's all different kinds of influences. There was no fight, except, well, a bit of one in Columbia. I can only speak to the situation in Charleston and Columbia. In Charleston, we got a fully accessible bus fleet in one fell swoop because our mayor, who is a great mayor, made a deal with the city of Atlanta that they would buy a bunch of new buses for the Olympics in '96, I think it was, and then sell them to us. That they took the depreciation and then sold them. at a bargain basement price, and so he replaced the whole fleet, everyone lift equipped. No activism necessary. Nothing had happened until that point. After that point, lift equipped fleet. And we have a paratransit service that's got a ways to go, still operating, and not a lot of activity on that. In Columbia, they are doing the gradual phase-in of lift-equipped buses. The paratransit system was so inadequate that people did start to complain, and the protection and advocacy system up there brought a class action suit with, I think, 4 or 5 plaintiffs that were willing to put their name on the complaint. And I was real proud of them that they were paratransit users, and they sued to get better service, and they settled it, and things are better now, and some people got paid some damages, and so, you know, that was a good success of advocacy. And it was activism, I think, for the paratransit riders to be willing to be plaintiffs. That was fairly gutsy, I think. It's tough, and whenever any of my movement friends from other places come to visit, I have to practically make them sign a legal document that they will not blame me personally for all the access problems. Because they naturally tend to think, well, you know, why have you let this stay? And I don't have a good answer. But the Charleston is, to me, very accessible in a couple of ways. One is it's totally flat. Another is that it's very compact downtown. You don't have to get in a car to go everywhere. You can actually wheel around to get lots and lots of places where you want to go. And the other thing is it doesn't get cold. So, you know, practically speaking, it's got some real advantages. On the other side, we have lots and lots and lots of buildings that were built way back yonder, not only when there was no access law, but when it was the style to have these oppressive architectural forms, these big flights of stairs that make you feel small and gasp at the majesty of power. And so, you know, it's a very inhospitable environment from that standpoint, and a lot of people value the past more than they value the present. They think that because their building is old, it's grandfathered in, and I go around telling people there is no grandfather clause, and a lot of times things can be done. It's more difficult, more expensive, but you know, bit by bit, things do get better, but it's a difficult environment to work in. Well, we had one just last week, which we shouldn't have had to have had. The state Supreme Court ruled on rehearing. They had already ruled it, but they were asked to reconsider. That the state owes a duty of care to people with mental retardation who are taken into the state mental retardation system. The state actually took the position that it owed no duty of care. And, you know, it's kind of a sad commentary that we had a ruling like that just last week. And I would like to find out a little bit more about the politics of that litigation, but the Supreme Court, with good sense, said that, you know, if you take someone in based on a finding that they're unable to care for themselves, well, then you have to look after them. And in this particular case, a young woman had, you know, taken off with a couple of men who, you know, stories differ, but anyway, sex happened, and she was supposed to be under supervision. And, you know, so it's yet to be determined whether the duty of care was violated. But yes, there is a duty of care. Thank goodness. Otherwise, what are they there for? And I can't think, what other landmark cases there may have been. Typically, we follow federal law rather than, being out there in the vanguard. Now, I brought a case that settled. It was the first time the issue was litigated, and it's now being litigated in California. But it involved a woman in one of these continuum of care facilities where she was living in an apartment, which was just like any other apartment you might rent from a private landlord. No supervision, no control, no oversight, separate entrance. She could do whatever she wanted to. And when she developed ALS and needed personal care assistance, the facility ordered her to move into its nursing home or be evicted. And we sued under the Federal Fair Housing Act and ADA and the comparable state laws to say that people in apartments are allowed to have attendant care. It's not the landlord's business how a tenant gets out of bed in the morning, and that rule should apply even in these continuing care facilities. And very sadly, my client died during the litigation, but we had gotten a temporary order, so she was able to die living where she wanted to live. And we worked out some procedural changes after her death. So that was one where, we were pushing the envelope a little bit. And my co-counsel in that was AARP. And I heard from the lawyer the other day on that they're doing a similar case in California. So hopefully the experience will be helpful. I guess the one that pops in my head is Kermit L. Short. Kermit, like Kermit the Frog. And Kermit died in 2005, I believe around March. And he was injured when I was 2 years old, so that was 1959. He had a very long run as a high quadriplegic, and was, at the time of his death, the director of the South Carolina Spinal Cord Injury Association. Kermit liked to call me his little sister in disability because I had been born disabled when 2 years before he became disabled as a young man. So I was always his big sister in disability. But Kermit had a career in the VA hospital system. He was the chief fiscal officer for the VA hospital in Columbia until he retired. And he told me that all those years, it was all he could do to do his job and take care of his body. To do the whole quad routine, to get his clothes on, to move his body from place to place, to feed it, to deal with its waste, all that stuff. And he worked and he took care of his body, and that was all he could do for all those years. And when he retired, it was like a kid let out of school. And he had an activist spirit, and he was probably one of the ones that voted to call our Olmsted event a rally rather than a meeting. That was okay with him. And he had a brilliant logistical sense that I think came from all of his years of quad survival. He could always tell you where to park. If there wasn't a good place, he would get the cops to bag a meter for you. And, just very good on logistics. And when he retired, he kind of made it a project of one by one to help people get out of nursing homes, particularly spinal cord injured quadriplegics. And he would go and visit and talk to people and hook them up with whatever resources they were. There are, reconnect them with their families in some cases. put them on the waiting list and let them know that somebody cared and another life is possible. And he hoped that some of them would join the movement when he got them out. But he shouldn't have been surprised that most of them had all they could do to keep their lives afloat. He shouldn't have been surprised, since it had been that way for him for so many years. But he did set some people free, and was just a delight to work with. And he would send me little emails, well, what do you think of this? What are you doing about that? And, who should I talk to? And really had a lot of influence, and I think a lot of us really looked up to him for the work that he did, but also as an example that even in South Carolina, even all these years ago, that you could survive as a high quad. And he had no family help for about the last 20 years of his life. He married his way out of a nursing home. He had been in a nursing home for 7 years or so, married an aide, got free, and that marriage broke up after several years, and he was on his own, and he had more creative strategies to get himself taken care of. And, he called me one day. There was a voicemail on my phone that says, I found a couple of Peruvians who were ready to drive me to Charleston. And so he and the Peruvians came down for lunch one day. So we never asked a lot of questions, but he's very much missed. Not for Kermit. I mean, Kermit charmed the socks off everybody. And his pitch was, he was a nice silver-haired old guy in a wheelchair. How dangerous could he be? And his pitch was, I'm from the Spinal Cord Injury Association. I understand you have a young person here. I'd like to visit. And, with a non-threatening approach, most of the people who work in nursing homes are not evil. They'd be glad for this person to have a nice old guy visit them. And he was very low-key, very soft-spoken, and he would back away when people were too scared, didn't want to think about that, or dug into where they were. But if they were wanting to talk about it, he'd sit and listen. And I never heard of him having any trouble getting in. I would probably have trouble getting in, but he never did. That has not been my work. I've litigated a couple of cases involving basically to prevent forced transfers, litigated or negotiated, to prevent confinement. But I basically am so uncomfortable in an institution that I decided I could not do that work effectively. And it's been on my conscience that I don't do that kind of work. I have tried through my connection with the Protection and Advocacy and other people that are working on it to act in a supportive role. But my bread and butter work is actually getting people onto Social Security disability and, trying to keep them afloat so they don't have the bottom totally fall out from under them. And then I've done some accessibility work and, various other things over the years. But the kind of one-to-one Underground Railroad work that Kermit did, I didn't do. Yeah, well, if you turned all the slave-built, occupied, traded, etc. buildings into museums, there would literally be no housing and no public buildings. I mean, every brick in these old buildings was built by slaves, and it's a living city. And it's, our past is very hotly contested. What it means, who decides. We've had, if you just use the phrase the flag, it usually means the Confederate flag because that's the one that people argue about, and appropriately so. But it is different here because slavery was the dominant means of labor in the Carolina Lowcountry for a lot of its history. And so coming at it from outside, it looks a lot stranger. And it may be analogous, before I ever traveled out west, I didn't believe cowboys and Indians were real. I just thought that was Hollywood. But you go out there and sure enough, that those Indians that the cowboys were shooting left and right were actually very real people, are actually very real people. And from the east, that whole world looks totally different. And I could not imagine how strange this world may look from that point of view. But the slave mart was actually the city market. Slaves were sold there, and so was everything else. And, agricultural products, whatever. And so it's still the city market. And to me, that does not seem too weird. The experience is very, very different. And I am still realizing how different it is because I've never had the other experience and wasn't really close to the other experience until I was grown because I was in this childhood group where most of the disabilities were either, at birth or soon thereafter, And I think it is very, very different to have been born into this particular situation of being classified as different, being looked at funny, not being able to do certain things. And I really look at non-disabled people almost as another species. And, I've compared it, sometimes somebody will say, well, don't you really wish you could walk? Don't you really wish you could dance, And it's, well, no. And, but I will look at, I know one time I saw a group of students, bounding up a flight of stairs. And it was just beautiful to see that energy and that grace and, the magic of those feet, running up the stairs, the balance that it takes and, coordinating all these movements. But it wasn't like I was putting myself in their place. It felt very much like watching a flock of birds take flight. You go, oh, and it's a beautiful thing. But it's not like I'm sad because I can't fly with the birds. It's just not what I do. It's not where I live. And I think for people that are disabled later in life, it's got to be different if they look at that flock of students and think, that used to be me. I didn't appreciate it. I didn't know, oh, I wish I could do that again. I mean, I think a lot of them do have those regrets. It's not like they dominate their life or they have no other reality or they don't adjust or they don't enjoy life. But there is something that they experience that I never have and never will, I hope. And over the years now, I work mostly with newly disabled people. And I see that for most of them, it's a very, very painful experience. There is just a lot of misery when you lose something you used to have. And I think that we all organize our lives around our abilities. And so it's natural to really mourn those losses. And, there is a real disconnect and difference there. Well, some people who are born in positions of privilege mistake them for bootstraps. And it may be that, I have no idea who you were talking to, but I have known people whose families were wealthy, certainly by the standards of the world, and for that reason they didn't qualify for benefits. And so they imagine that the benefits are somehow harmful to the poor people. And I don't think I've been under that delusion. But John Kenneth Galbraith said one time that rich people are under the delusion that, or he said most people are under the delusion that the rich are idle because they don't have enough money. You give them tax breaks, giveaways, etc., to encourage them to do more. And the poor people are idle because they have too much money. And, I don't think that's the way reality is. But were benefits in the picture for me? No, my family was perfectly able to support me. And I was less expensive than the other kids because I was banned from private school until age 13. And, my sister had to have ballet lessons and I didn't, and stuff like that. So, it was not a financial issue to take care of me. And the one time in my life that I could have qualified for benefits was when I went to law school, because I had been working and I quit my job to move to Columbia and go to law school. During that period of time, I could have gotten Social Security disability, but I didn't know it because I thought you had to be unable to work. And I was not unable to work. I had quit a job. And now that I'm a Social Security lawyer, I know that the operational definition, I would have qualified based on my medical condition and the fact that I was not then working. And I didn't know that. So I never have been on benefits. But I think the benefits are good things. I think they could be a lot better if we structured them in a way that didn't force people to get to be poor, and that didn't punish work so severely. But they beat not having any money by a long way. I don't know what the numbers are. It certainly is an issue. And it's probably like anywhere else that there's a mix of people with and without disabilities of various kinds. But I do see in my Social Security practice that there are a lot of people who have no homes, but who are not living on the streets. They've got, 2 or 3 different relatives that they camp out with. They'll stay on their sister's couch for a couple of months. She'll get fed up. They'll go back to mama. Then it's some friend's car. That they are not on the streets and maybe not counted as homeless, but they really don't have a place where they have a right to stay. And they may camp out with relatives for years, but have no place that is really theirs. And you see that a lot. But it's a phenomenon I really wasn't aware of until I started handling cases where, they were hardworking people that lived from paycheck to paycheck, and the paychecks stop, no more rent and no more utilities, and so they will manage to stay off the streets, but they don't really have a home. Well, the first one, which was the second one to be published, I started writing in around 1994, kind of for my own amusement. And what it was a story set in a cross-disability summer camp, very much like the one I used to go to. And I just started doing it because I had always wanted to do something with that material. And I had tried, a college sociology paper and this and that and the other thing, and I really couldn't get hold of doing what I wanted to do with the material. And so one rainy Sunday, I just came up with the idea to tell a story from a different point of view about an imaginary person in that place. And I tinkered with it for about 10 years. And at about year 9, somebody gave me a book on how to write a novel. And it's like, oh, I did that in year 7, I did that in year 5. And so it was a fun process, but very protracted because I really didn't know what I was doing. And but anyway, it was really for my own amusement, and I did have a sense that the non-disabled people who are my best friends now had no clue about the world I came from. And I just, kind of venting my frustration about that. I wanted to spend a little time imaginatively in that world. And so I worked on that. And then in the year 2002, I was invited to go to Princeton University by Professor Peter Singer, the famous animal rights philosopher who, among other things, proposes that parents should have the right to kill disabled babies at birth. And he invited me to come up and give an opposing view, and I did. And from that, I wound up on the cover of the New York Times Magazine. I wrote a story about it, and they not only took it but put it on the cover. And when I got on the cover of the magazine, actually, before it got out, it was leaked to a New York literary agent who calls me up, well, what else have you written? What else have you written? And I wasn't interested in doing anything with any of that. But he kind of wouldn't go away. And when the story came out, I suddenly had emails from more than one publisher and more than one agent wanting to handle my book. And so I contacted him because by that time, he'd done a good job enough staying in touch with me that I thought he could probably sell a book. And so I met with him, and he told me that he would be glad to represent me if all I had was this little story of growing up in a crip camp. He said he thought he could find that a nice home where it would be appreciated by a few people. But he said if I would write a nonfiction book, that would be a big deal. So anyway, he, again, wouldn't go away. It was like, well, if you were going to write a nonfiction book, what would it be like? Blah, 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 blah. And before long, I had written a book proposal, and he had set up an auction, and people bid on it. I was astounded. And that wound up being a sort of a memoir in long prose stories that's called Too Late to Die Young. And so I wrote that within a year, and that was published by Henry Holt in New York. And then they also published the novel the following year, 2006. Sure. And so that's the story. Very well. Holt had unrealistic expectations as to the sales, and they probably paid me more than they should have. But my expectations were not so grandiose, so I'm pleased. It's out there in the world, and lots and lots of libraries have bought both books, which is cool. And they've been, pretty well reviewed, and they're out there. So.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
You working in a follow-up?
No, I really, I like practicing law very much, and that takes a good bit of time. And I really didn't plan to be a writer, but I felt like those opportunities were too good to pass up. I hope that I'll be doing more magazine work, magazine articles, because that's pretty manageable with the rest of my life. And I just got word that the New York Times newspaper will publish a short piece I've written about Tiny Tim during the holiday season this year. So that's a lot of fun. Well, I think it's just interesting. For one thing, I mean, there. One thing that has energized me in the movement are just the variety of the people and the stories and the backgrounds of how people got into it and what they've done. I think just as tales, they're wonderful. And we don't like to use the word inspirational because that's been way cheapened by overuse. But they are inspirational stories of people who have solved their own problems or coped with their own problems and gotten way beyond themselves to make the connections to other people and, literally change the world. It's exciting to think that the world can be changed, and it has been changed by the movement. And I think that that can give heart to people who are working for peace or racial justice, economic justice, that people with very few resources can do a lot. And that's one thing that's different about the movement. We've never been able to turn out 100,000 people for anything, and we never will. Um, we've never had a lot of money. We never will. Um, we have people who have a really hard time getting to the meeting. They can't drive. They have, they're living on SSI. They're stuck somewhere, but yet they manage to contribute to changing the world, and that ought to give heart to all the other people that feel underfunded and under-resourced. Um, and I guess, the other thing is I feel like it really is all one struggle, that the way disability has historically been talked about, it's like, well, we are the virtuous poor. We are the truly needy. We are the ones who deserve the help. And to some extent, we have fed into that because it's to our individual advantage. And if we can get past it and say, look, the reason, Harriet Johnson got a law review and pays a law degree and pays taxes is not her courage and determination, but the fact that her mom had contacts to get her into high school. That the resources were there. That can raises the possibility, well, what would non-disabled people do if we could get them the resources too? Why not get everybody the resources and see what they can do? Another one of my favorite historical examples, Helen Keller, very, very famous part of disability history. But people miss the point that her father had enough money to bring Annie Sullivan in to stay there 24/7 for years. That it was resources that taught her to spell WATER at the pump. And yeah, it turned out that she was extraordinarily intelligent and had extraordinary gifts, but it was the resources that brought them out. And, what would happen if other people had the resources? You know, some of us, I mean, everybody in the U.S. says they're middle class, so I think I'm middle class. But certainly compared to the world's people, I am very, very rich. You know, I have money in the bank that I don't need right now, and that makes me rich, I think. But I think most disabled people understand that even if you are rich, it only carries you so far. My wealth would be exhausted by not very much time in a nursing home. And so I think a lot of us, are capable of understanding that even for us, we need the social support. We need to know that it'll be there if things fall apart, and that things are likely to fall apart. Okay. I had an accident. I fell out of my wheelchair and was out of work for a couple of months. And something like that could just burn up your money. And there's no job to go back to, and, on and on and on. Something like that happened 5 years ago. That could have been the end of it. But I had enough resources to see me through that one. Next time I may not be so lucky. And I think it's that way, really, for just about everyone. Now, Donald Trump's probably okay. But for most people, their resources are more finite than they realize. And the nursing homes are full of people who used to be rich and powerful. Most people manage to deny that reality. But if you're living with a significant disability, the denial is pretty hard to maintain. I think when you say worry, it's institutionalization. That's what I worry about for myself, and that's what I worry about for everyone. And I think when you're talking in terms of society, institutionalization represents not only a really tragic impact on lives and families, but it means that we are disconnected from community. And once we are disconnected from the people who might otherwise care about us, we're vulnerable to abuse, neglect, exploitation, and even extermination in various forms. That all those things become possible when you remove people from connections with other people. And, right now we are seeing movement away from institutionalization. I have reason to hope that that movement will continue, but it might not. We may have, enough kind of misreported fires in group homes or, homeless, mentally ill people causing problems. These anecdotal stories that get blown up and blown out of proportion may make it swing the other way, that we have to put them all in safe places. And if that happens, it's a tragic loss for the people who are affected, but also for a society that's trying to be decent. Because it really is true that when you're out of sight, you're out of mind. And I can say that with a mea culpa, because when people are institutionalized, I no longer visit. I'm scared to go there. And so that makes it even more scary, knowing that that's my attitude. How am I going to depend on people to visit me?